have a £5 note. And I'm going to do something I've never done before, which is that this is a tiny little shredder. Now, this may make you feel uncomfortable. If it does, you're not alone. And I should reassure you that I will be donating £5 to my favourite charity, which is the suicide prevention charity Maytree, to make up for this with these little bits here. It does make people feel very uncomfortable to see money destroyed, even though these are just bits of paper, and yet they seem to mean something so much more to us. Famously, there was a group of people who burnt £1 million. The K Foundation, who were the band KLF, they famously upset a lot of people when they went to the Isle of Jura, and as what they said was a work of art, they burnt £1 million. And that was back in 1994. And people really hated them for it. People were furious that they'd done such a thing. They said it was art, but they also sounded slightly confused when people asked them why, and sort of troubled by so many people asking them why it had happened. They said it's just paper, what does it matter? They said there's no less bread in the world, there are no fewer apples in the world, why should we care so much? And what I'm interested in is not so much why they wanted to do it, as why everyone hated them so much for it. If they'd just wasted their money in straightforward rock star fashion and thrown televisions out of hotel windows, or spent a fortune on drugs or fancy cars or holidays or yachts, people wouldn't have minded, and yet people minded that it was spent on nothing, that it was wasted. And psychological experiments since have confirmed how much we hate seeing money destroyed. This is a piece of research that was done by the psychologists and neuroscientists couple, Uta and Chris Thriff, and they ran a study with colleagues in Denmark, and they showed people this film of a banknote being destroyed. They were in a brain scanner while they watched this film. Some of the people watched a piece of paper of the same size that what clearly wasn't a note being destroyed. And they found exactly the same thing. People found it distressing watching this money be destroyed. Interestingly, a part of the brain that was activated when they saw the real money destroyed is one associated with the use of tools, with using, say, pen knives or knives or cutlery or things like that. There is an extent to which, money is a tool, and this is why people were so upset about the £1 million, that, obviously money represents opportunity and choice. It represents choice of all sorts of things that you can do with it, that when you exchange it. And that's because we've all decided to agree that it does. And interestingly, when it comes to the brain, even though money represents something you can get in the future, like someone gives you some money now, you need to go and exchange it for something to have an actual thing. But again, research using brain scanners has shown that we know that reward centres will be activated when people have something like squirts of apple juice put into their mouth, or chocolate, or something nice. Different parts of the brain are activated for the promise of a chocolate in the future. If you give people some money while they're in the scanner, that same part of the brain for immediate rewards is activated. Even though you can't have the object you can exchange it for straight away, there's something we really love about receiving some money. Feels very rewarding to us because it does represent so much. And it is fascinating that money is a future reward, really, and yet it means so much to us. What I've set out to do is to look at the best research from around the world that's looking at the topic of money and our minds, to see what it can tell us about some of the curiosities there are about an individual's relationship with money, and also what we can do about it, not necessarily with the aim of making us richer, but to have a healthier relationship with it and to use it better to enable our well-being or increase the well-being of other people as well. I don't have one single thesis except that it's clear that money changes our thinking, our feeling, and our behaviour, and that when it's scarce, it can have even more of a hold over us. But I do think by looking at the evidence that there is around money, we can look at some of the mental traps, the cognitive traps, if you like, that we can fall into, and then we can have what I call mind over money. Now, we constantly make assumptions about money that say big bonuses will encourage chief executives to try harder, or that we can bribe our children to do their homework, or that when we're faced with a set of deals, we know exactly which one to choose, that we know which one is best. The evidence shows we're not always right about this at all. We all decide that this piece of paper has value, or actually probably doesn't have value anymore. Now, I don't think that money is the root of all evil. Obviously, it can cause trouble, but it is a useful system. It allows us to trust each other, to make deals with strangers, and to do all sorts of wonderful things. The difficulty is that our relationship with it isn't always straightforward. Now, we do tend to think that we're very good at spotting a bargain. Why then do we do things like we'll bid more in an auction just because the previous item that has nothing to do with ours and is nothing like ours has gone for more money? We will spend hours online or drive for miles to save £10 or £20 on something cheap, and then we fail to shop around to save £20 on something big like a car. We just think it doesn't matter anymore. We get much more pleasure from winning, say, £25 in a lottery one day and £50 in a lottery another day than we do from winning £75 all in one go. Again, it's the same amount. It should mean the same thing to us. And we're not even very good at judging what is good value. In fact, if something looks expensive or if we're told something is expensive, then we're very easily fooled by that. I want to tell you the story of a man called Rudy Kurniawan. He was a dealer in vintage wine. In 2006, in just 1 year, he was dealing in $36 million of wine. He would insist on taking all the other people in the wine business out for luxurious dinners and buying very, very expensive bottles of wine from the restaurants. And he was very young and seemed to have come from nowhere, and people were very impressed with this. Everyone loved his wine. And these were real experts who liked his wine and would spend an absolute fortune on his wine. But he did have one rather strange habit, which was that after he drunk these expensive wines in restaurants, he would always insist that the restaurant sent the empty bottles to his home. And he said that he was starting a museum of wine in his house. Eventually, he was uncovered as a fraud, and he is now in prison for that. This is what they found when they searched his house. He had, instead of a corkscrew to take corks out, he had a piece of equipment for putting corks back into bottles of wine. He would get the fancy bottles from the restaurants, soak the labels off that you can see there on the right, and then he would dip them in tea, that old good traditional method of making things look old, and stick them on new bottles, and he would mix some real vintage wine with cheap wine, and that was how he created more and more bottles. But he did make some mistakes, like wine from a year before an actual vineyard had started making wine and things like that. And that was how he eventually got caught, and it's thought to be the largest wine fraud in history. What's really interesting is that because people were told the wine was good and was expensive, they believed that it must be. Loads of the wine had to be thrown away. There were some bottles that they thought could be saved, and so the US Marshals, trying to make back what money they could for people who'd been defrauded, did have an auction of some of the wine just before Christmas this year. And they said that they thought it was probably real, but they couldn't absolutely guarantee it. And yet, 3 bottles of a 1911 Romanée Conti went for $43,000, even though people knew it was his. Although this example might suggest to the contrary, what is interesting is that on the whole, wine experts do better than the rest of us at tastings, which you would hope they do. In an analysis of 6,000 blind tastings, only the experts knew which were genuinely expensive. If people were told it was expensive, then they thought it tasted better. So they, again, put people in a brain scanner. They fed them wine through a straw, which may not be the ideal way of drinking wine, but who knows. And they told them it cost anywhere between $5 and $90. And people liked the ones that they were told were expensive much more. But what's really interesting is that our brains are wine snobs too, if you like, because there was more activity in the reward centres for the ones where they were told it was expensive. So they were actually genuinely enjoying it more because they thought it was more expensive. We love things that we know to be expensive so much that sometimes it is worth paying more for the same thing. If you take painkillers, ibuprofen, cheap generic version, and this is a fancy version. They have the same ingredients, but one has lovely fancy packaging and is branded, and it shows it's powerful with the picture. In a trial, people's headaches actually went faster if they took the expensive branded one, even though they contain the same thing. In a way, there was the placebo effect was harnessed, and the fact that they thought it was going to be good meant it was. So if your headache is really, really bad, maybe you do want to spend more on exactly the same thing, that maybe it does actually work. Or if you take an all-you-can-eat buffet. Obviously, the idea with an all-you-can-eat buffet is to get as much food as you can for as little money as possible. But there was a study done in the States. Some of the people paid a higher price and some of them paid a lower price. The people who paid the higher price actually enjoyed the meal much more, and they felt less full at the end, which suggests that when it was cheap, that people were more tempted to overeat because it was such a bargain, whereas when it was expensive and they were paying more, they actually took more care over choosing and didn't overeat. This doesn't mean that you should always just buy the most expensive item or even go for the mid-priced item. I want you to imagine you want to buy a laptop. You don't want anything fancy, you just want to be able to browse the web with it and write some documents on it and keep some stuff on it. So you decide, well, there's lots of cheap laptops around, I'm going to go and buy one. And you will often find that they're laid out in threes. This is from a real website, a cheap laptop for £329. A bit fancier, same make, faster processing speeds, and that's £479. But then cleverly next to it, you'll find this very fancy one, which is £1,999. What people will do psychologically is they came in, they were going to buy the cheap item, had a quick look and they saw the really fancy one and they thought, no, I don't need anything as fancy as that. I can't afford that. That's too expensive. I won't have that. And they then think, I'm being very good about this. And they compromise. It's called the compromise effect. They compromise on buying the middle one instead, when they never intended to do that. If they'd just seen the two, they'd have thought, well, what's the point in getting the more expensive one? The cheaper one looks fine. People will very often be tempted to buy the mid-priced item. Since reading all the research on this, I've tried very hard not to buy the mid-priced item, but it's very, very tempting. I just find myself wanting to do it all the time. Once we know about these things, we can try to have mind over money, if you like. We can try to observe these biases in ourselves. Now, interestingly, we can also get distracted by completely irrelevant prices through what's known as anchoring. There's been lots of work done on this by Daniel Kahneman and others that you might know of, which is where a number affects our decisions. Even though it's completely irrelevant, it makes a difference to our decisions. So in one study, people were asked how much they would be prepared to pay for a menu in a restaurant, an imaginary restaurant called Studio 17, and how much they would be prepared to pay in a restaurant called Studio 97. People were prepared to pay more in the second restaurant, even though the word 97 in its title, had absolutely nothing to do with anything. Now, there are all sorts of cognitive biases that mean we don't always make the best financial decisions. And the optimism bias is an obvious one. Most of us think we will be better off in the future. We think we'll earn more in the future. We think we'll save more in the future. And we think we'll spend less in the future. Just as we all think we'll have more time in the future and that we'll be more organised versions of ourselves. And I don't want to disappoint you, but sadly you probably won't. Unless you're going to take some real steps to do that, you're not going to have more time in the future or be more organised. Nor are you probably going to save more and spend less unless you take real steps to do this. Research shows that we make better decisions when we're feeling grumpy and also when we're not desperate for money. So actually going shopping when you're feeling grumpy or going to do something where you really want to think about whether it's a good deal while you're grumpy, maybe looking at houses, is a good idea. And we also make better decisions when we're not desperate for money. And some of you will know the research from Sendil Mullainathan in the States on scarcity, where he found that when something such as money becomes more scarce, people's thinking narrows and their IQ can even drop. And they become more likely to make unwise decisions because of the stress and the cognitive overload of trying to deal with not having enough money and being really worried about where you're going to get your rent at the end of the week or whatever it is you need. No wonder then that people get stuck with debts that they can't pay. No one sets out to get stuck with big debts. People genuinely believe they can pay it back. Now, struggling to make ends meet is undoubtedly hugely stressful. But what about the opposite? One big question with money that people always ask is, does money make people happy or not? And stories of lottery winners seem to hold a strange fascination for us because we know that there are these people who suddenly find themselves stratospherically wealthy, and we try to imagine what that would be like. We also, interestingly, expect the winners to be deserving, even though the word lottery is in the title. And we don't like it if we find that, people have, a terrible criminal past and win loads of money. People then say, well, it should be paid to the victim for their crime. But we also quite like the stories where it all goes wrong, which make us all feel a bit better. And there seem to be lots of these, in particular in the US. There was William Budd Post III, and he won $16 million in 1998. The judge ruled that he must give a third to his landlady. He then married 7 times and got divorced 6 times. He went to prison for firing a shotgun at a debt collector. He went bankrupt. His brother hired a hitman to try to kill him, so it didn't really go well, and he ended up calling it the lottery of death and said that he would rather he'd never won. But things went even worse for Abraham Shakespeare, who won $31 million in 2006. First, a colleague accused him of having stolen the winning ticket from his wallet, and then he met a woman who wanted to write a book about how everyone was after his money and how everyone treated him badly now that he'd won this money and he couldn't trust anybody. And she kindly offered to take over his financial affairs for him. You can see where this is going. And then later, his body was found buried under concrete, and she is in prison for his murder. A Swedish study of lottery winners shows that most people are very careful with their money. But there is a downside to winning the lottery, which could make the rest of us feel better, and that is known as the experience stretching hypothesis, which is that people with less money savour experiences more. Just showing people photos of money primes them to reduce the average time that they savoured chocolate for, down from 45 seconds on average to 32 seconds. So the idea is that if you can afford the very best, then you get the very best and you stop getting pleasure anymore from the small things. So my advice for new millionaires is don't splurge for the best straight away. You need to do it very gradually. But what about money and happiness? This is a man I know who happens to be very rich. He's enjoying himself there with his money and happiness. The famous finding relating to money and happiness is known as the Easterlin paradox, which lots of you might have heard of. So this is the finding that within a country, rich people are on average happier than people with less money. But when you compare the level of happiness between different countries, average income only makes people happier until it reaches £15,000 or £20,000 or £25,000, depending on which study you look at. But a more recent study has tracked people for far, far longer and found that this increase in happiness does seem to continue. So now some researchers argue that it continues up to when people are earning about £75,000, that they'll be happier than the others. Others, that it might continue on forever. But of course, these are only averages, so you can, of course, still be rich and miserable. But what's really interesting is that the rest of us overestimate the difference that income makes. So if you ask people how happy somebody earning £90,000 is, people will say that they're much happier than they really are. If you ask people how much somebody earning a much lower income is, people will think that they are much unhappier than they actually are. But what I find interesting is not so much, in a way, the acquisition of money for its own sake, but how people can spend what they do have in a way that maximises their own happiness. There's lots of interesting research from psychologist Elizabeth Dunn in the US on this, which boils down to you should spend money on experiences, not on products, in order to maximise the happiness you get from that money. And one of the reasons is that we anticipate experiences for much more than we do anticipating, say, buying a widescreen TV. We don't think that much about what it's going to be like, whereas you might think for ages about a holiday and what that's going to be like. Or this next study will give you a clue about how to spend money as well. People were given an envelope with either $5 or $20 in it, and the envelope had a note in it, which either said this: spend the money on yourself, you've got until 5 o'clock to do it, or please spend the money on someone else, or give it to charity. Again, they've got till 5 o'clock to do it. So the first group, who had to spend the money on themselves, bought earrings and sushi and coffees. The second group, who had to spend it on other people, bought toys for relatives and gifts for people, or gave the money to charity. When they rated their mood at the end of the day, the people who'd had to spend their money on other people had significantly higher ratings of their moods than the people who had spent it on themselves. And you may have seen the sort of movement that there is online with some people suggesting that you should pay for things for strangers to make yourself happier, that you should stand in the coffee shop queue and say that you'll pay for the persons behind you. Giving money away does make us happier, and in low-income countries, men give away more money to charity. In high-income countries, women give away more money to charity. But what about richer and poorer people? There's a whole literature on whether richer people are meaner or not. The psychologist Paul Piff in the US has done loads of studies on this, where he observed people crossing zebra crossings. He looked to see which cars would stop, and he found the expensive cars were less likely to stop than the cheaper cars. He also got people to play Monopoly, and he made some players artificially rich at the beginning by just giving them a load of money to start the Monopoly game with. And he would find that they would, triumphantly stick their boot or their car around the board, very sort of loudly, and that they ate more of the pretzels that had been left out for them. And also, at the end, which was interesting, when they won, inevitably, because they started with loads more money so they could buy loads of houses, they then asked them why they thought they'd won, and they thought they'd won because of their own skill, which was interesting. He even found a higher proportion of rich people who said that if they were on the Titanic, they would deserve to be in the first lifeboat. But there is also a whole other load of evidence suggesting that they are generous. So the super rich give away 4.44% of their money, compared with an average of 2.3%. Now you could argue, well, they can afford to do it because once you've got the basics, the other people need to buy the basics first and have less to give away. They've also done experiments where they drop letters and see if people will post them, and people are more likely to post the letters in richer areas. There are more living kidney donations in the richer states in the US, Utah being at the top of those. I've shown you a few ways that we can learn about mind over money, but I think charities could also learn from some of this research as well when they design their appeals. Charity appeals often feature pretty children, but in fact, research shows that those children are seen as more popular and more able to help themselves and more likely to get help from other people. So actually, it could be a mistake to have children that are too pretty because people think, oh, they'll be fine. Also, interestingly, and some new research last year found that people tend to decide how much to give to an appeal according to the number of people who've been killed rather than the number of survivors after an earthquake, say. So what charities need to do is to stress what survivors need and how many there are, and to show photos where children aren't too attractive, but where they also look active and as though they are starting to help themselves. People also don't like the pictures where people look as if they're passively waiting for help. There's lots more to say about, when financial incentives do and don't work, and how easily they can backfire, and how they can work in very specific circumstances, but only if you get it absolutely right. Many of you will have heard of the famous nursery in Israel, where they were fed up with parents turning up late to pick up their kids and staff having to wait for them, and so they decided to institute a system of fines. After they'd instituted the system of fines, every parent was then late at least once a week, because they now saw this as a service they were paying for. So it completely backfired and didn't work. People were much kinder when they thought the poor staff were waiting for them. So they got rid of the scheme. It turned out that they didn't go back. Their behaviour didn't go back again. So one thing with financial incentives is you need to be sure you can carry on with them, but you also need to be sure that they will work in that situation and not crowd out people's goodwill or make people suspicious. There was a study done in Switzerland where they offered people money to have a nuclear dump situated near them. They offered them lots of money. It was something like 1,500 euros a year, continuously. When they offered more money, people were less likely to agree that it would be okay to have it near them. So people then thought, rather than thinking, well, it's got to go somewhere, I suppose it might as well be here. Instead, people thought, well, why is it so bad that they're having to bribe us? If you're going to try to use a financial incentive, you need to be very clear about what behaviour it is you're looking for, what you want them to do, and they need to know how to do it. So, you could offer me £1 million to beat Andy Murray at tennis, and I'm still not going to be able to do it much as I'd like to get that £1 million. And what is it you want them to do? Do you want them to stay longer hours, or do you want them to take more risks? Do you want them to take less risks? Do you want them to consult with other people more? You need to know what it is you want them to do, and it needs to be very transparent. And of course, the bonus system is famously not transparent, with people waiting, not knowing when they'll be called into offices to be told what they have or haven't got. The evidence about whether they will do work is very limited. Looking at research from around the world has made me think very differently about money myself. So I'm very grateful to all the researchers who designed all these clever studies. So hopefully I've made you wonder a bit more about money too.